grabbing some water, so let me just. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Bobby McKenzie. I am the Director and Senior Fellow for the Muslim Diaspora Initiative. It's a new initiative that I founded about 60 days ago, and it's an initiative that looks at Muslim communities in the United States through a non-security lens. And so I was both intrigued and delighted when I was offered the opportunity to moderate this discussion, in large part because I've spent the last 5 years working on a range of topics that are directly relevant to countering violent extremism. And I offer this just to give you a sense of how my own ideas have been shaped and informed. I spent a year and a half out in Abu Dhabi setting up the Hidayah Center, which is an international center backed by 29 governments looking at the ways in which we can try and prevent and counter violent extremism. And in that capacity of setting up the center, I traveled to over 15 capitals and met with senior officials. And a couple of observations emerged from those travels. And one is that there are a lot of folks across the globe who are hyper-competent and very concerned about Sunni violent extremism. And that's great, but many of their efforts are at very high-level meetings in places like New York and Geneva and here in DC, and often missing from these conversations is what's happening at the local level, what's going on with Muslim community leaders and other faith-based groups. The second thing that I've noticed is that theoretically and on paper, a lot of the ideas to counter violent extremism sound really smart, and they are smart, but when one moves from theory to practice, there are problems analytically and programmatically. And the third thing that I've picked up on, and this is with my more recent work, both at the Brookings Institution where I was before I came here, and now in the last 60 days having visited 6 different cities across the country, is that when I talk to Muslim community leaders in the US, they say that we don't see a problem here at the local level with violent extremism. We're not seeing a nexus in our particular neighborhood or at our particular mosque, a nexus between this place and violent extremism, and yet the US government approaches us as if there is a real problem here. And so I'm really delighted to have 4 speakers here today that are going to talk about some of these issues through the lens of how do we measure violent extremism and how do we think about countering violent extremism. And I should note that some of my colleagues here are tracking across the country since 9/11 the number of deaths from individuals that could be labeled Sunni jihadists. And the number is under 100 individuals that have been killed. That's 100 too many. But if you compare that number to the number of deaths by white extremists, it's about the same. And before the Orlando attack, the white extremist deaths were about twice as many. But if you were to poll your average American, they would presume that the numbers at the hands of Muslims, deaths at the hands of Muslims would be skyrocketing. And this is in large part because not just this last political cycle, where certainly we were in a toxic environment, but in a post-9/11 environment, there is palpable fear about Muslims in this country. And this is really problematic because the fear doesn't match the actual threat. So let me briefly introduce my 4 panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to have some really smart things to say, no doubt. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. I just ask when you have a question that you keep it to a question, not a statement. And I ask that you state your name and your affiliation. So to my immediate left is J.M. Berger, who's a fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. And directly to his left is Ben Dubois, who is a co-founder of Omelas. And next to Ben is Muhammad Fraser-Rahim, who is the executive director of North America Quilliam International. And next to Muhammad is Jonathon Morgan, who's the CEO of New Knowledge Founders, Data for Democracy. So I will, as one aside here, I hope not to put you under any pressure, but if any of you have been following the news, there's a few issues out there on the topic of Russia. And my colleague and friend right here, JM, along with another dear friend of mine, Clint Watts, 3.5 years ago, said we're seeing some strange things out there. And we're not sure what's going on, but we're sure the Russians are meddling at a very local level in the US. And so I'm delighted to have JM talk about CVE, but the truth is he is truly an expert on social media and the ways that social media can be used for good, but also for ill. So without any pressure, let me turn it over to you, JM.
Well, thank you for having me, and no pressure at all. So I'm typically the CVE naysayer who gets invited to all the CVE events to talk about how much I hate it, and that seems to be a pretty good career path for me. As Bobby pointed out, there are really a number of problems that have to do with not only with measurability, but also with the types of activities that we classify under CVE. So, you know, town leagues and town halls and soccer leagues is the joke that we usually use. There's a lot of stuff that happens that is not really measurably correlatable to violent extremism, and you know, stuff that makes sense intuitively, like people need better education and then they won't become violent extremists. People, if they have jobs, they won't become violent extremists, and you know, none of this stuff really holds up over time. And when you look at larger populations, what you do find is that in some small populations, you might be able to make a statement like that about a town or a region, but overall, a lot of the efforts that we make on violent extremism have been typically pretty ineffective because they're aimed at things that don't correlate to violent extremism, and we don't have any mechanism to measure the success of the program. So at the end of the program, everybody pats themselves on the back because they got a bunch of people in education, but that doesn't tell us anything about whether it reduced violent extremism. Since I've been with ICCT in The Hague, I've been working on really sort of outlining my objections in a more systematic form. I've done 2 papers over the last year that really go to this. One really proposes that, you know, the concept of de-radicalization, which is at the heart of a lot of CVE efforts, is difficult to measure and difficult to accomplish, but disengagement from violent extremism is something that could potentially be measured and can potentially be accomplished. So instead of trying to change what's inside somebody's head, I'm sorry, when I look down, I seem to get a big volume boost. Instead of measuring what's inside somebody's head, you measure what they do. So this offers possibilities in a social media environment. For instance, you can track an audience. You can see whether somebody is following ISIS, as an example, although I'll get to why that's problematic right now in a minute. But you look at somebody's following ISIS or Al-Qaeda, you can measure whether they're following people who are putting out Al-Qaeda propaganda, whether they stop following them, whether they're retweeting their material, whether they stop retweeting, whether they're engaging with people who are in the organization, whether they're not. That's a measurable thing. And so it makes more sense to target that engagement than to worry about what they're thinking. At the same time, you know, I think that we all understand that it is important to get at these dynamics, to really, you know, it is important to understand what's going on in people's heads, and maybe we can approach that problem. The issue with that is that we don't have any kind of consensus about what extremism is or radicalization, and we don't have any way to measure that stuff. So the second paper that I did in the last year, which is called Extremist Construction of Identity, is an effort to build a framework that you can start evaluating people's extremism, and it defines extremism in a way that I think has not really been done before. The definition is that you're an extremist if you believe that the health of your in-group, the community that you're in, can only be maintained at the expense of an out-group. So you have to take action against somebody else in order for your community to be healthy. If you can't separate that negative action from the health of your community, then you're extremist. And then that gives us a basis to start evaluating how extremist something is and how people become extremists. And there's a framework that I outline in the paper for that. Just to touch on the Russian stuff before my introductory remarks are up. There are a lot of different elements to that, and one of them, and one reason that I took an interest in this in the first place, is that on social media, Russian influence operations have been heavily focused at encouraging domestic extremism in countries outside of Russia. So a lot of what they do is encouraging nationalist movements, far-right movements, racism, anti-Muslim sentiment. And they are able to pour large volumes of material into the social media ecosystem, and it has an effect. And we're seeing that, and we're seeing resurgent right-wing movements, you know, in the United States and Europe, and they have demonstrable, obvious ties to Russia. For instance, the Russians hold a conference in St. Petersburg every year for far-right leaders. Many American leaders have been there, many European leaders have been there. And they reinforce that with a great deal of social media activity, deceptive social media activity designed to create what Jonathan and I were talking about this yesterday, the appearance that consensus reality supports your views. So it's one thing for you to believe in some kind of far-right idea or conspiracy theory. It's another thing if you believe it and you think that 100 other people or 1,000 other people believe it too. So that community creation, combined with the messaging they do, the type of messaging they do, is really very specifically targeted to foster uncertainty under the framework that I just wrote about. And so it's a big contributing factor to the problem that we have with violent extremism once you get outside of the ISIS lens.
Great. Hey, I'm Ben. I'm founder of Omelas, and at Omelas what we do is automate, integrate, and quantify the different approaches that exist right now to countering violent extremism. I actually think we have a few slides up that show our platform. We can present those. Yeah, and so it's very prescient that, or a good transition that JM was discussing, tracking how many people are actually following these different accounts that are spreading ISIS propaganda, other extremist propaganda, and seeing the effect on the likelihood that they share it after being exposed to something, because that's one of the things that our platform is trying to enable people to do. So what you're looking at right now is from research that we conducted on propaganda spread by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the successor group to al-Qaeda in Syria. And by a number of measures, they're actually more prolific on social media right now than ISIS is. And so what our platform enables users to do is to get some semblance of a scientific understanding of what makes their propaganda effective, what pieces of their propaganda are effective, and also how effective counter-messaging is. So in this example, we found two groups of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or Hatash, social media accounts, a few under the name Agency One News and a few under the name IBA Agency. And we monitored these groups for a couple weeks and found that their followers were sharing a similar amount of content that was actually created by Hatash. And after running a counter-narrative campaign, we measured the change in likelihood that they were going to share it. So we have two very similar groups. With only one of those groups do we actually provide a counter-narrative. And then we see whether that group is going to be less likely to share extremist content after seeing the counter-narrative compared to a control group. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the results. So the orange line here is the group that we actually served with the counter-narrative, and we were able to see that they actually became less likely to share that content after seeing the counter-narrative. And the overarching point of this is that with this platform, with social media analytics where it is, you can actually get some understanding not just of overall metrics, but compare it to a control and narrow down and see what pieces of your counter-messaging campaigns are actually effective in achieving a change in people's connection with these extremist groups.
So thanks for allowing me to participate. I wanted to just start off to say that, you know, I am a recovering counterterrorism analyst, intelligence officer. I just want to put that out there in the room. Worked for the U.S. government for a decade. for the Director of National Intelligence, and then obviously at the National Counterterrorism Center. So I want to just say that to start off the conversation, that coming from my optic point and lens, I saw counterterrorism, or CVE, excuse me, as part of the larger counterterrorism toolkit. I can say now that I have been out for about a year and a half, 2 years now, and working with communities, particularly my role at Quilliam, there are real-world issues taking place at the grassroots level in dealing with young people who have been radicalized. And so I wanted to bring this down a bit from the 50,000-foot level, which we could certainly engage on, and I'm sure we'll have time to talk more about. But what we are doing right now are we are directly working with youth who have been radicalized. There are young people in the Washington, D.C. area and elsewhere that have been referred to us via friends and family that have come to our attention, and they range from urban young kids who are African American, who are Latino, to white Americans who could be from Potomac. And so the diversity of approaches, the practical solutions in which we are working on to find tangible ways to engage are adaptive, they are innovative, they're iterative as well, to address mental health concerns, to deal with the ideological aspect as well as just sort of the groupthink that's certainly emerging on the scene that we're seeing in the contemporary context. And so for us, we're seeing oftentimes a disconnect between the literature and practice. You know, the literature speaks to one thing. There's a wealth. You can go and do a lit review on a number of individuals and organizations that are looking at what are the appropriate responses to combat extremism. But then you have, at a grassroots level, community level, of finding and dealing with individuals who need surgical interventions that are really individually specific as well. And so a lot of our work has been working on that sort of front. And so the debate that we've seen in sort of the popular discourse is that, is there a causality between sort of the interventions that are being offered, and then how do you measure up with offering specific examples that really can tailor toward individuals as well. So I will say that we're all experimenting. We are as well. As I have to deal with a youth tomorrow, I'm trying to find out, you know, is this a mental health situation where I need to bring in a psychiatrist, and how do we deal with this? How do you then look at sort of measuring if this will be successful in, for example, in Kenya? Will this be successful in Saudi Arabia? And how do we find good practices that we all can collectively borrow from? I don't use the terminology best practices because that uses the assumption that someone has found a solution. Last time I checked, and when I turned on the news, there was an attack taking place in Afghanistan just a couple days ago. Whether there are far-right movements that are emerging, and let's use perhaps better terminology, maybe they're ethno-nationalists, et cetera. We have to find, again, real solutions to address a growing, ever-evolving dynamic that is keeping us all up at night. I'll stop there, and then I think we'll allow more time for Q&A.
So a few years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago now, I got involved in kind of advising from the perspective of a kind of a data and technology practitioner, the White House and the State Department about how to do CVE specifically with kind of online communities. And that came out of because JM and I had done some work together focused on ISIS specifically, and that kind of led to this engagement. And what became clear pretty quickly was that CVE is not an outcomes-based discipline. As much as it might like to be, it's a very output-driven discipline, and that there's a lot of counter-narrative production, there's a lot of programming, but no real sense of how to measure success, because what is extremism and how would you measure less extremism, whatever that means. And so after that engagement at New Knowledge, we went about trying to figure out, like, well, okay, let's try and give a kind of an easy definition of extremism, one that we could actually do something with. And that was just, what's an extreme deviation from the mainstream on some vector? And so, you know, you could be an extremist Justin Bieber fan, Or you could be an extremist in support of a radical ideology that could potentially lead to violence. And that was right around the time when the alt-right was becoming sort of a popular in the news cycle. And so we looked at far-right extremism as a kind of a proxy for extremism in general, and to see whether or not we could identify communities where extremism was present and whether we could see their sort of trajectory over time. And it turns out that if you analyze the language of extremist communities, you can measure mathematically the difference between how they conceptualize certain ideas and the mainstream. And then you can also measure everybody else kind of somewhere along that spectrum. And so we were able to break down the kind of sort of broader, maybe very conservative community on social media, very conservative sort of US-based community on social media, and find pockets that were sort of more extremist than others, and look at communities that have the concept of Judaism as sort of similar to socialism and homosexuality and some kind of epithet, as opposed to being a religious descriptor. We started applying that to different online communities. We looked at Twitter, we looked at the comments on Donald Trump's Facebook page and found that his supporters there were being sort of radicalized in a similar way. And then we looked at the comment section on Breitbart News, which is exactly what you would expect it to be. And what's interesting is that this same technique of basically breaking down a community's language and looking at who's introducing kind of new, novel, extremist ideas into this community and who's successful at getting those ideas to propagate throughout the community at large. If you start identifying those people across multiple communities, it starts to look like somebody's doing it on purpose, which also led us to investigating the same issue from the Russia perspective. And earlier this year, we released some research that showed that right around April, May, June, and July, which I'm told is consistent with all publicly available signals of Russian influence, so say my friends in the IC, who can't comment on any privately understood signals of Russian influence, that this is a real indicator. If you can understand who is injecting ideas into communities, that you can see who might be responsible for an influence operation. So this relationship between Russia and the far-right extremist movement in the US is not for nothing. I think that there's actually a real interest. It's not just propaganda and influence operations, it's the sort of folks who they're targeting and the potential consequences of that targeting that we should all be, I think, pretty concerned about.
Thank you, Paul, for your introductory remarks. I just want to open up a question to all of you, and it touches on what Jonathon talked about, output versus outcomes. And by that, in terms of output, there is a lot of output on this. And for those of us on stage who have worked on these issues for some years now, I mean, this includes to what you were referencing. I mean, it's everything from after-school mentoring programs is CVE, to soccer programs, to youth literacy, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of spaghetti is thrown at the wall to see what sticks. But we have really no idea of even measuring what's sticking. And so I think that the three of you, right, I think it was JM, Ben, and Jonathon talked about online, this social media ecosystem and how to try and identify what's going on. But we also had Muhammad, who talked about interventions, where you can also measure to some degree what's going on. So the question is, as we look forward with this particular administration, with any administration, if we want to move away from this framework of output versus outcomes, how do we start to get at this? What would be a better way of thinking about, one, violent extremism, and how do we counter it, whether it's online or using the kind of interventions that Muhammad touched on? So I'll open it up in any order.
So the thing about online is that over time it has proven to be an extremely accurate proxy for offline. So the advantage of designing and implementing programs and approaches online and measuring them is that you can then take the lessons learned from that and put them into an offline context and take them to an intervention. And so the window has kind of closed on doing this kind of work on ISIS. The ISIS on social media problem, despite the fact that we still have governments clamoring for action from social media companies. In fact, there's not much more the social media companies can do at this point. The big companies, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, are very aggressively dealing with this problem, and there is a diminishing returns to any investment that they're going to put into suspending ISIS accounts at this point. The ISIS accounts are warped. Their networks are warped as a result. Tahrir al-Sham is a much better, at this point, probably a good laboratory for us to sort of investigate what kinds of messages will work to encourage disengagement because they have much more robust presence online, and it's probably due to their separation from Al-Qaeda and the attendant ambiguities, the social media companies are not likely to crack down on them in the same way. So there should be a fairly natural network that we can experiment with and sort of design messaging for. And you know, we can obviously do this on the alt-right and the far right, but then you get into very highly loaded political questions about who's paying for that research and whether it spills over into the mainstream. So
so just to drive home your point about how really data-starved this field is, George Washington University conducted a meta-study at the end of last year of every CVE program. They found only 5 that collected empirical data about the results of those programs, only 1 that showed a positive outcome, and it was a basketball program in Melbourne, Australia. And the way they measure, and it was between Jewish and Muslim youth, and the way they measured it was how likely somebody was to choose somebody from a different ethnic group for their basketball team. So that's the extent of data that we have right now. And I think you're going to run into a problem with a field that's just trying to figure out how to get its metrics about what really should be looked at for radicalization. So JM and I both talked about how likely they are to share, to retweet something from an extremist site. And at Omelas, we're actually developing a score that measures somebody's entire online profile, how similar it is to known extremists. But even that, you know, it's something we just came up with. And I think the way to really address this is you need to try to provide as many metrics as possible and be as honest as possible. And if one metric shows it's working and one doesn't, you know, there are always going to be huge incentives to only go with the one that works. But it's really essential that we include as many metrics as possible, that we look at this in as many different lenses as possible, because the simple truth is we don't know which metric right now is best at measuring how somebody actually feels, how likely somebody actually is to commit an act of violence in the name of extremism.
Just to follow up on that point, I mean, and this is to JM's point about disengagement, but also to your point about interventions. Rather than, and I would like to hear from all of you, but rather than, but let's start with Muhammad, but rather than trying to go at the entire community to try and figure out who, you know, on the spectrum of extremism, where they are, if we've already identified people, and I think the FBI says there's around 1,000, why not have a intervention program? I mean, and I know that the government is still toying with this, and we're doing this in onesies, twosies, but I mean a full-on intervention program and see how that works. And the intervention program would be bespoke and tailored based on the needs of that particular individual. But this idea of how do we identify who's going to go off the deep end, I worry about that, because all of a sudden we start to continue down the path that we're currently on, which is the law enforcement and the FBI doing community engagements across the U.S. like they've been doing since 2009. And by community engagements, for those of you that aren't familiar, the FBI and local law enforcement meet with Muslim communities across the country. And from what I hear, time and again, across the country from Muslim community leaders, is that they're not crazy about these programs. But in many ways, they feel compelled to participate. And so I guess I would ask, as a follow-up, Muhammad, with the interventions, why not have an actual policy where we focus on interventions and then we try and, I mean, there would be some metrics around that, no?
Well, I mean, there are some programs that are already out there. You've probably been familiar, or may not just sort of come on the radar in the past 6 months, is Parents After Hate, the father of Carlos Bledsoe, Abdul Malik Mujahid, who carried out the attack in 2009 at the Army recruiting site in Arkansas. His father saw the aftermath of what do you do? And there are other family members who are struggling. You know, is there a 24/7 hotline? Who do you call? You know, you're not calling Ghostbusters. You need to call someone for assistance. And so you have that. You have the Montgomery County model, Brave as another example. So there are sort of onesie-twosies, as you mentioned. I think, to be frank with you, this struggle of finding interventions that actually will stick is a big debate. And then quite frankly, if we just focus on the Muslim community for a second, because I think it's important to look at the broad spectrum, there are internal debates within the Muslim community of, and you've probably heard of, is CVE something that should be done within the Muslim community? Is this something that is contrived by the US government? Is this an action that is part of a decades-long plan of running subversive actions with Muslim population or minority populations? So you're having this sort of an internal debate between, is this something practical that can be done? And then is law enforcement the actual vehicle to do it as well? The struggle is, how do you get communities to address internal issues that are really, in many instances, centuries-old issues, and confronting a challenge and a problem within? That's part of it.
Let me just follow up with a question, though, because what I hear from Muslim communities across the U.S. is that we're not seeing these problems internally. Sure. I mean, when the individuals go off the rail and commit these horrible crimes, we didn't know them. I mean, we didn't know they were on that particular path. Flint, Michigan is one example that someone, the FBI is looking for someone from Flint who apparently was an ISIS recruiter, they believe. And the Flint community is around 150 Muslims, families up there. I know them quite well, and when I went and met with them to talk about a full range of things, they said, you know, we've had the FBI here, we've had local law enforcement, week after week after week. We said, this guy didn't participate in one community event with us. And yet the focus isn't on any of the good we're doing to try and resolve the Flint water crisis. The focus is on, did we know that this guy was a sleeper cell? They said, we had no idea. And so I guess what I'm hearing across the US from communities is that we're not seeing an internal problem. And that the individuals who are going off the rail are often doing this online. They're doing this in the privacy of their home, in the basement, or in very small groups. So I guess that's the perspective that I'm hearing.
And I think that that's a legitimate. I mean, I'm from these communities. I'm third generation African American Muslim. I went to Quranic school, learned Arabic as a young child, got fluent in Arabic and studied abroad, all that sort of religious education, and went to public school in the American South. And the mosque that my father is the imam at is integrated. It's part of the fabric, and largely speaking, they have no issues. But what happens when you have communities that, or you have third spaces that are operating? So not maybe within the mosque itself, third spaces that are taking place that unfortunately are corroding the good works of what the larger mainstream Muslim community is doing. So it's a struggle. It's not a sort of black and white issue. There is an internal challenge of the rise of this very skewed literist interpretation that's permeating in many communities, not just in the US, but globally. And then you also have sort of private engagements where individuals are recruiting and trying to get people online. Mm-hmm. And what I would argue to say is the same way that a drug recruiter, the same way that a gang recruiter seeks to target youth is the same way you want to address an extremist trying to target young people too as well. And it's going to be different. It's going to be complicated. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all in all location, as you know, as you sort of highlighted already.
And I think that kind of points out, like, why are we doing this in the first place? Why do we care about extremism online in the first place? It's not. We don't care about it just because. We care about it because if it exists, then people can discover it, and people can discover it in the privacy of their own home, and there's the potential for them to self-radicalize. We've known about this potential issue for a long time, and nevertheless we run around bothering imams and Muslim communities at mosques because we think that that's the only way to do this in the kind of the community engagement model that the FBI has been following since the 1970s, when back to far-right extremists again. And I think that we don't stop to think about why we're doing this, and we don't stop to think about what we can actually accomplish. Because I think in this context, there's two paths to dealing with the online threat. You can reduce the kind of operational capacity. You can reduce somebody's presence, which is largely what we've done with ISIS. People aren't discovering ISIS content on Twitter anymore and getting led down down the rabbit hole. That doesn't happen because it's been largely wiped away. But then the other thing that you could possibly do is engage with people and change their minds if you think that their ideology represents a threat to your well-being. And that's something that ostensibly counter-narratives are supposed to do, but we have no way of measuring whether or not they're successful. And so I feel like the fact that there is no clear strategy, there's sort of no succinct tactical objectives to CVE in general, is what leads to the situation that we're describing. There, you can identify individuals and perhaps engage with some kind of intervention strategy, and everything else is sort of the blind leading the blind. Yeah.
I think there's, to some extent, some of our attitudes and policies about this are driven by what happened in the 80s and 90s. So before the rise of social media, you did have recruitment took place in mosques. You did have people would go to mosques, they would try and infiltrate their content, and they would do it sometimes with content that was not objectionable. So it would be about Bosnia. We're going to go in and talk about Bosnia, and then you use that talk about Bosnia to recruit somebody into becoming a mujahideen in Bosnia. And since 9/11, the Muslim community is adapted. And there is, before 9/11, you know, there was just kind of a very loose attitude about this. In the same way the government's attitude was very loose. The government knew that Americans were going to fight in Bosnia. They didn't really care. Government knew Americans were going to fight in Afghanistan. They not only didn't care, they kind of were in favor of it. So, you know, what we've seen and what a lot of our program ideas and politics fail to account for is that there's just been dramatic change since 9/11. And that change is twofold. One is that the community is adapted to an unavoidable problem. So this was a problem you could be in denial about before 2000, and you can't be in denial about it anymore. But secondly, social media is fundamentally more conducive to extremists than operating in the real community is. Discovery of people with fringe views is far easier on social media. You can have conversations with somebody who's a violent extremist without putting yourself at, you don't have to like hang around with somebody who's violent, might be violent to you. You can talk to them and get comfortable with them before you have to interact with them. And so the structure of social media really has given extremists an ability to do an end run around the gatekeepers that controlled the old media infrastructure. You know, before the biggest success that white nationalists had in the 1990s was getting a public access channel on cable that might have an audience of 5,000 people.
Just to follow up on that question about social media and the uniqueness of it, of bringing particularly extreme individuals together. What kind of knowledge do we have about our ability to actually engage them and try and dissuade them from that particular path? What metrics are there out there on this? And this is for all of you.
I mean, I think it's...
Rather than just shutting down accounts, but I mean our ability to actually engage.
I think that right now we're thinking about it from a very like CT, counterterrorism point of view, whereas what I see in general is that most of this work is focused on identifying individuals, like kind of NSA style. Let's collect everything that we possibly can, and then in that huge haystack, let's go and find these needles, because these are real anomalies. Like anybody who would potentially engage in an act of violence based on being radicalized with some ideology is like, it's so rare, right? As to be perhaps impossible to identify these folks individually. So I think that a more realistic strategy is to think about group radicalization, look at communities where there's a high degree of extremism, generally speaking, identify the people in those communities who are influential, because they're the people who are already authentic and credible voices in this community that's at risk, and can disseminate messages to the rest of the community in a way that will be heard. And I think that that strategy of identifying those credible voices, partnering with them on issues where there's some kind of shared values, and encouraging them to encourage their communities to step away from the ledge, seems more realistic to me than finding the 10 people on Twitter right now that are potentially at risk of committing an act of violence, tracking them down and like direct messaging with them, and you know, as fast as we can to try and stop them from whatever they might do. You know.
Do we have any success though in engaging with these influencers to the degree you just mentioned? Because that seems super hard to me, because they're already down a particular path.
But they're not. I think that's the thing that's interesting about this, is that so often there's communities that are on a trajectory, right? And I think that there are examples of identifying people. There are online examples of people who've reduced the amount of hate speech in a particular community because they faked an influencer in that community. So there's sort of there was a fantastic example recently of a couple researchers who looked at communities with a high degree of racism, like racial epithets being used by members of some online community, some Twitter community. And so every time somebody in the community would use a racial epithet, they tested one account, both fake accounts, one fake account that had an avatar of a black person, one fake account with an avatar of a white person. And then they responded to the person who made the racial epithet and they said, hey dude, that's not cool, we don't talk like that around here. And the fake account with the white avatar and a high follower count reduced the amount of kind of racially charged language in that community. So it is possible to target people who are engaging in this behavior and say, we basically, before this gets out of control, before this becomes a law enforcement issue, when it's just people being jerks, right, or just people talking about things that make us uncomfortable, let's see if we can diffuse that before it becomes an issue. And so there are examples of that being successful, I think.
Yeah, I was actually going to cite that exact study. But yeah, so you can sort of think of radicalization as almost like a sales funnel, that it starts at this very high level where they're doing sort of a spray and pray approach, trying to jump on to really popular hashtags, see who responds, feed them a little bit more propaganda, make it as unobjectionable as possible at first. Then when people show more and more interest, then you get to more and more extremist propaganda. And while that's obviously a problem that's occurring, it does open up a huge opportunity, because outside the world of countering violent extremism, hundreds upon millions of dollars has been invested in going on social media and tracking it to understand how that sales funnel works. Advertising companies invest literally billions of dollars a year to understand how people interact with them on social media, what makes somebody become loyal to them on social media. And because that technology exists, we really can get a much deeper understanding of how that sales funnel is occurring, what's actually causing people to go further down it, what's actually causing people to turn away from it. And that gives us the power to really start pushing back and to really understand the radicalization process at a level we haven't before.
I would just add two things to this. I mean, the first is with the funnel, the question is always, where do you target the funnel? So violent extremism is a game of very, very low percentages. So, you know, you send a message out to 50,000 people in the hopes that you get one person who's going to adopt it and join the group. With such low percentages, there is a strong argument to be made, I think, that you really target people who are way down the funnel after a lot of the people have been filtered out. And secondly, and this is a related point, one thing, the paper that I just did on identity construction looked at how Christian identity formed. And one thing that became clear over looking at a century of their texts is that every time their legitimacy was challenged, it forced them to come up with new and more elaborate justifications for their beliefs. And so much of what we do in the CVE space today, or historically, and maybe we won't be doing anything going forward, has been targeted to big audiences. So we're going to go out and talk to all Muslims about this problem. And what we're doing frequently is we are framing this in the form of, again, this is historical, much of our messaging has been devoted to saying that ISIS doesn't represent Islam. ISIS is not legitimately Islamic. And the study of Christian identity suggests that attacking legitimacy is a sure way to escalate the justification. So there are, that it would, you know, what the research that I've been doing, and I'll have a new paper out that applies this methodology to ISIS in the next couple of weeks, is it may be better to undermine the arguments that they're making rather than do this head-on attack. And you know, I think that a lot of, you have to measure what your audience is, right? So when Obama comes out, you know, and says ISIS is not Islamic, he's trying to reassure Muslims in this country that he's not out to get them. That's part of what he's doing. So that message serves an audience, it serves a purpose for that audience, but maybe it serves a counterproductive purpose for somebody who's in the radicalization spiral.
Thank you. Let me open it up now to the audience. We're going to have someone that's going to pass around the microphone. Again, please state your name, your institutional affiliation, and please keep it to a question. Let's start in the front.
Hi, hi, Miriam Bacher, Austrian public broadcaster. I have actually two questions. One for you, Mr. Rahim. How do you reach out to these young people? Where do you find them, and how do you, talk to them, and what kind of your good practices are? And to the social media experts, have you ever done a study about the Donald? The subreddit the Donald, and about the dynamics there, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
To answer your question, the community itself. It's the old sort of neighborhood, a friend, a grandmother, an aunt, a cousin. I'm on the board of the America's Islamic Heritage Museum that's in Southeast Anacostia. I would highly suggest you, if you haven't been, you should definitely visit there. And I would, it's community members who know me. There are people who, if they don't know me, they know they're looking for organizations that they can work with that are addressing front lines issues. And we're not the only one. There's others that are out there too as well that are doing really good work. And then there's sometimes there's the referral by law enforcement too as well. That's one of many other approaches. But I will say is that the issue is only growing, it's increasing. And just last night I had a family member of someone who I know who reached out asking for assistance. Again, early on they're not knowing what to do, and so they're trying to reach out to organizations that it can at least address some of the challenges that this young person's dealing with at the moment.
If I could just follow up, actually, because I think this is fascinating what you said. Could you provide us a little more specificity without sharing confidences? But when they reach out to you, what's a typical case look like? You said a grandmother, an auntie, a cousin. What are they coming to you with?
Yeah, I think that, listen, my background, I'm a historian, Islamic history, African, Middle Eastern history. I studied classical Islamic studies in West Africa, Timbuktu, and Senegal, and the Middle East. So the theological arguments I can work with myself. Oftentimes it's not theological. There's the mental health issues that are roadblocking me even trying to go counterpoint based off of theological issues. Just like what my colleague mentioned earlier, right? That's necessarily not going to work. What I will say is that there are other aspects that have to be addressed. So the mental health issue is a big one right now that I think is something that we are addressing, putting structures in place to deal with individuals ranging from autism to schizophrenia too as well.
Sure. I guess my question is, though, what is the threshold before someone reaches out to you? Are they saying, my kid's online, or are they saying, I've heard my kid talk at the dinner table about X?
I think it's a combination of all that. It's people who are like, I don't know what to do, and I need to talk with someone, and let me reach out to someone who I think knows what they're doing. And so that's the first start. That's what you do want. You want someone to in the worst case scenario, this may be nothing at all. But if it's nothing at all, let me pass it on to organizations that can aid with me to put together something, a plan, a structure, a program that will address a very personalized experience as it relates to their vulnerability to extremism. So, we're still experimenting. I want it to be very clear. We're still experimenting as we're dealing with this, because one person, we're all different. We're very much the same as humans, but we're very different in how much you need to give, how much involvement an individual may need more, clinical assistance, being evaluated. And so we're dealing with it on a case-by-case basis.
Great. And the second part of her question, maybe, for the others. Okay. My apologies.
So, about the Donald, if you're not the Donald, our president, but the Donald, a subreddit. So if you're like fortunate enough not to be familiar with this particular subreddit, it's pretty much just so Reddit's a kind of a website where you can vote stories up or down, whether or comments up or down. Sort of, it's pretty much its whole thing. And the Donald is a subreddit. It's a particular community on Reddit that was sort of a gathering place for the alt-right. And I think it's interesting to talk about it in the context of how ideas spread from one online community to another. So what's interesting about the Donald is it was sort of like a meme factory. It was like the minor leagues for memes, kind of alt-right memes. And so they'd sort of test out ideas, and ones that kind of percolated their way to the top and became popular inside the Donald are the sort of memes that you'd eventually see in more public spaces like Twitter. And so I think the Donald's a more public one. Anybody can access the Donald, and like most subreddits. But there are also other channels where people are gathering in more private ways. So there's a community called 4chan that you're probably maybe have heard of, but hopefully haven't experienced in person. There's a section of 4chan called poll, only for the strong-stomached. But it's another place where it's sort of an ephemeral community. The messages only last for short periods of time, so people will gather there. It's anonymous, brainstorm ideas, talk about sort of campaigns they want to run. When the Macron leaks came out just before the French elections, there was a group of people on 4chan gathering to decide how they wanted to promote those on other social media channels. There's a platform called Discord, which was largely for gamers, where people are gathering in sort of popular Discord channels. Centipedes, I think, is the one that was sort of the alt-right kind of pro-Trump channel. And so the reason that the Donald is interesting is less so as like another example of like people posting swastikas and Pepe the Frog memes, but mostly because it's a breeding ground for some of these ideas. You can sort of see how some of these concepts are incepted. So,
and to JM's earlier point about just having a whole new audience for extremism, so on Reddit there's the front page, which is every subreddit, so every community within Reddit, and any piece from any community can make its way there. And because the Donald had that strategy of just going after memes, you had people who may not have been interested at first just going on Reddit for any of the other reasons, finding these inviting memes that they thought were funny, and then going to that community at first just to share memes with their friends, and makes it a much more accessible way to get there than, say, having to follow an extremist Twitter account that's going to lead you to Stormfront.
And I think this is an example, not to like, I know we have more questions to get to, I'm sure, but I think the alt-right stuff is probably more accessible for most of us here in the US. It's a little bit easier to understand intuitively why people get attracted to it. But I think we went really deep on ISIS, really deep into understanding the mechanics of their ideology and the sort of ideological underpinnings of the arguments that they were making. What we're seeing with the alt-right, if we want to call that synonymous, which I don't think that it is, because for lots of reasons, obviously, there's no like alt-right state. So it's a different thing. But many, well, okay, maybe there is. They were just more successful in infiltrating the mainstream. There's so many like President Bannon jokes to make right now that I'm just going to step right aside. But I think the reason that people get attracted to it is exactly that. I mean, there's just something iconoclast about the alt-right. It's sort of anti the mainstream. It takes all the things that, as a young person you might find grating about the way that you're supposed to behave, and it kind of gives them the middle finger, and it gives you permission to be the way that probably most of us were as teenagers, which is the way that adults do things is stupid and wrong. And I think that it's an attractive thing that is, relatively speaking, that kind of rebellion is innocuous. And so the fact that that's a gateway to much more dangerous behaviors, I think, is probably something worth looking at when thinking about kind of extremism in general and the target audience for most extremists, young men.
Thank you. Right here.
Kat, USAID, Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs. I actually have a question for the group. I think, as we go forward with this narrative, especially internationally, development and diplomacy have really been asked to step up and play more of a role in countering violent extremism. And we have for a while, but especially as it pertains to development work, I want to hear more about this kind of counter narrative, because I think you know, some of the issues that we've been having is our basic assumption anyway that the narrative is that this has to do with grievances, and if we solve those grievances, then we solve terrorism or extremism. From I guess a lot of our work, we struggle with what is that counter narrative, because you really have to understand the situation in a localism to be able to inject that counter narrative. So I would like to hear, I guess, a little more from the group of how you get to that counter narrative.
I'll just say, sorry, just briefly, you know, the terminology, you know, I think it's all about semantics and precision. I mean, we use the terminology, particularly at Quilliam, inclusive narratives, because again, inclusivity, being holistic, addressing the globalization, right? That is needed more than ever. We've learned a lot since 9/11. I think we can't use the same terminology and language. That's gotten us but so far. And so at least starting off with inclusive narrative pushes against this idea of countering anything, and instead being in a posture of sort of strength to say, what is the real issue that are grievance-based, that are structural-based, that are theological perhaps, that are ideological. There are a number of factors. And so I think that language just has to be addressed first and foremost, and then number two, addressing it at the local level. I think, you know, throwing money out at a sort of broad brush global level just won't address what we're dealing with, which we're seeing very different dynamics in different locations that are perhaps different even within countries themselves.
So my next two papers are going to be on this subject. And what I've been doing is taking the sort of the tools that we use to look at social networks, meaning network graphs, and applying them to narratives. So a narrative can be understood as a series of concepts that are linked. And so the next two papers that come out are analyzing Islamic State propaganda to look at their message. And very broadly, what I found was there are three kinds of groups that are discussed in extremist propaganda. There's the in-group and the out-group, but the in-group breaks into two parts when you get into, so in the extremist, the Christian identity paper I looked at, there was really no organization. They weren't recruiting into an organization. They're just selling a worldview. For ISIS, because there is an organization, you have two in-groups. You have the eligible in-group, which is Sunni Muslims, and then you have the extremist in-group, which is ISIS. And you can track the linkages in these narratives. So the out-group, which in a lot of Islamic State propaganda is Shia Muslims, although they have many out-groups. But the out-group causes a crisis, is linked to a crisis, and you can draw that as a graph. And then the crisis is afflicting the eligible in-group, and the extremist in-group has the solution to the crisis, and so the eligible in-group should join the extremist in-group. So when you take that very high-level thing, what you can then do is go into the message, and I'm doing this with specific pieces of propaganda, and get really, really detailed about it. So I look at a speech by Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, and he very conveniently, his rhetorical style makes this very easy because he likes to give lists. So he says, here's what ISIS is, and then he gives a list of qualities that ISIS has, and here's what Shias are, and here's a list of qualities they have. So you can map this out, and what you can see is that some things that it promotes are just designed to burnish the appearance of the group. So Islamic State is courageous, which is one that for some reason, our institutional response to terrorism automatically attacks that. No, they're cowards, right? But that the Islamic State is courageous is a message that just, in social networking terms, in network graph terms, it's a pendant. It just hangs off there. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just enhancing the appearance of the group. When they say the Islamic State protects Sunni Muslims in Iraq, that is an appeal to the eligible in-group, and that's a messaging point that you should attack because it's bridging. It's not just hanging out there. And they put so much stuff out that it can be overwhelming and people just want to push back on every single piece of it. But in reality, what you want to do is you want to break the linkages. You want to break the link that they make between the out-group and the crisis, and you want to break the link they make between the extremist in-group and the eligible in-group. So you can go into their messaging and really very specifically identify what are we going to counter-program against.
What's one in the back? The lady in the back, on the left.
my name is Niran Saraf, and I'm from a company called Lore. We do machine learning and AI. So this sounds, it's kind of depressing listening to that, to be honest. Like, okay, are we losing the battle here? But I have more question regarding domestic issues. So we all talk about Muslim communities and everything. And my partner lives in King George, which is like very white, redneck, and also black. So, but they don't mix. They live together, but they don't mix. And when I go down there, I'm actually very cautious to not come across as misinterpreted as a Middle Eastern whatever, you know? Although I am from the Middle East, but I try to be cautious because of ignorance. So my question is that we're targeting the Islamic community, you know, Muslim community here. We do so many programs for drugs, sex, you know, people who go into sex trafficking, teenagers are the vulnerable ones, right? They not like, no one, she looks ugly, someone comes and recruits her to become you know, into porn and all that. So similarly with kids, you know, if I look Muslim and I'm in a King George high school where I'm made fun of because I wear a scarf because my parents forced me to wear a scarf, or I have to fast or whatever, so then I'm gonna get bullied because of my background. How effective is really educating the parents? So for signs for my kid is gonna be a drug addict or my kid is gonna be a radical. And also, how important is it, just like we're doing a lot of anti-bullying, how important is it to really educate these kids? Because my partner, who's African-American, who's Christian, doesn't understand why are Muslims you know, killing themselves and killing others. And I have to actually explain to him what it's all. And this is a guy who's kind of dating a Muslim person. So, you know, so I mean, can you imagine if I go to a redneck who's never been outside King George, what his view of Muslims are?
Thank you.
We'll try to give 30 seconds so other people will have Q&As as well, questions. You know, education is important. I mean, I always make the distinction between culture and religion. There's a lot of cultural dynamics that are going on that are outside of religious concepts and oftentimes get conflated into two. That would be my quick, short answer. I think that, you know, critical thinking is important too as well. I see one of my one of the mentees that's here who works with me on some of the interventions too as well, and we can say that, you know, critical thinking is at the core of some of the programs that we have on the horizon. You know, think about the Socratic method, Socratic dialogue. You know, there's a concept, one of the things we have going called tafakkur, to think, to ponder, to reflect in Arabic. That is a time-honored tradition that has gotten away, but how can you bring secular concepts too as well? How can you bring good practices in other aspects of life, not just religious sort of concepts, and sort of synergizing the two?
I would say we have a big problem right now in that 30 to 35% of the American public is going to take efforts to encourage diversity and plurality as an attack on their politics. And so to institutionalize programs to figure out how to get this message out is extremely difficult right now. And it goes to what I said before about attacking legitimacy. If they feel attacked, they'll double down. If you go into that, you know, redneck kind of county and start preaching to them about who they should be accepting of, some of those people are going to get more radicalized by that rather than less. So ultimately, I think that, you know, first, for a number of reasons, this can't be a government function, at least not this government. And secondly, I think that probably the best solution is really interaction. The more you meet people who are different from you, the more you understand that they are people like you.
Great, thank you. How about the lady right in front of you?
Hi, I'm Denise Baer from the Center for International Private Enterprise. I haven't heard much discussion of gender. I'm kind of curious, are there differences in terms of interventions or measures in terms of the attraction of or response to violent extremism?
Just for the record, this is a very gendered panel here. We did have Ben's colleague was not able to make it, so but no, go ahead, Ben. Why don't you take the gender issue since you stepped in for Evanna?
No, it's a really good question, and the focus really has largely been on men. I mean, such a large percentage of the actual acts of violence are committed by men, which is actually mirrors what you see in crime rates as well, pretty closely, as well as with age. So it's a very solid question. I really wish I had more details on what we were doing around gender, but our focus has been perhaps too much on male, at least from my side.
I'll just say briefly, you know, there are organizations that are working on this. One that I'm a big fan of is Sisters Against Violent Extremism. Dr. Edith Schlaffer's worked on a lot of this, that women are front lines of defense against extremism. She's run a lot of programs, particularly the mother schools, throughout the world. I know she's doing work now in, I think, Zanzibar, just looking at women as being sort of advocates of turning young men away from extremism, if we just use the men. But also, I think she's doing some work on fathers, too, as well, and working sort of that intersectionality, I hate that word, but we'll just use it for now, between women and understanding some of the issues that they're dealing with, as we're seeing shifts of tactics, techniques, and procedures by ISIS and Al-Qaeda to employ women, whether they're wearing an abaya, to just diversify their tactics as well.
We're going to take 3 questions at a time now, just for the purpose of time. So if you can, maybe we can go the 3 individuals right there.
Hi, this is Jill Turner. I'm from MSI. You talk a lot about the counter-narrative, and these are either direct measures of programming in the counter-narrative or they're proxy measures for change in communities. What other work is being done out there about things like Kat said, which is grievances, relative deprivation, or other things that kind of marry the, the micro, which is what you're doing in these communities, with the macro, which is what people are saying? Is there other work out there?
If you could pass the microphone to the gentleman to your left, please. That had a question? Great.
Hi, my name is Mustafa. I'm from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. I am a CV practitioner. I wanted to know if you guys have any validated measures that, I guess, measure empirically found driving factors like identity crises, like grievance, et cetera.
And then finally, the lady that had her hand here in the middle, if you could pass the
Yeah.
microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you talking about me?
I think, no, just in front of you. I think someone had
okay.
there. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Fatima Ismail. I'm an intern at the Washington Center. So I was just wondering what kind of reform is going on when it comes to FBI tactics, especially within, like, when they're addressing these issues within the Muslim community, because oftentimes Muslims do feel like they're being attacked when they come to the FBI when they want to address these grievances or these issues within the community, and they feel like their children will probably never be seen again, will get locked up, and these types of things are going to happen to them after they, put them to the FBI. So what kind of actual reform is going on within the FBI?
So the first 2 questions, I think, are related. You're talking about this kind of root causes stuff, and I think that, the issue is really that a lot of the root causes research suggests that the things we assume are root causes aren't. So what I would suggest, and this is an area that I'll be writing about in the future, not immediately, but in a couple months or a year, is that it's not any particular thing. It's not joblessness. It's not any one factor, education, or there's a drug problem or a crime problem in the community. It's when the status quo is changing dramatically in a community, I think, is when it is vulnerable to extremism creeping in. And there's some really interesting research being done by a researcher named Michael Hogg. He's published several papers on what he calls uncertainty identity theory, and he suggests that people being uncertain about, when you have uncertainty in your life and uncertainty about who you are, whatever the cause of that, and all this other stuff can cause uncertainty, it's the uncertainty that makes you vulnerable to an extremist message, because extremists promise to reduce uncertainty.
It's probably that and exposure, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's no, I think Jay makes a really good point, that this idea that, like, if we could just solve joblessness or whatever, that we'd somehow solve the problem, I think is true. I think there's been a lot of really thoughtful research, qualitative research done, but I think, to your point, there's no validated quantitative research, I don't think, along those lines. And so it really is a combination of perhaps identity and then, of course, exposure. If you're not exposed to extremism, you're probably not going to invent it on your own.
Paul Gill, I think, researcher in the UK, said it very well recently. He said it's you know, all these things are things that depress your immune system, but what you get exposed to determines what kind of, if you're going to get sick and how you're going to get sick.
To the first question, so I think we focused on counter-narratives just because the topic is measurability and counter-narratives lend themselves to easier measuring. But we were actually talking backstage earlier about how basically everything and anything can be considered CVE. I mentioned earlier a basketball program was considered a CVE program. And you see all sorts of community programs that you know, would normally just be about building community resilience, building stronger bonds between communities that can actually have some impact on countering violent extremism, or you assume they would, since the topic of this is measurability, and I don't have any data to support that. I'll just leave it at I hope that's the case.
On the FBI element of the question, I would just say, I wouldn't be optimistic about things getting better anytime soon.
Thank you, Jan. I mean, there's no question that, I mean, since 2009, I mean, the FBI has engaged across the country in what they term as community outreach. But to your point, I mean, this is what I'm hearing everywhere I go across the country, is that we don't like this, we don't want this, but we also don't know how to push it off. I think there's a lot of concern. So but to JM's point, yeah, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Can we take 3 more questions? And this will be, I think, the final 3. Maybe we can go the 3 gentlemen here. Just right here in rows 2 and 3.
My name is Sean. I'm from Xavier University. And my question is in regarding to finding problematic propaganda. Do you guys use more of a linguistic tools or like contextual evidence? Like what do you guys use to like statistically map propaganda? Because I mean there's so many different layers of rhetoric. So yeah, can you elaborate on that?
Hey, my name is Jared. I'm here with the Washington Center. I intern with Faith and Politics over on Capitol Hill. My question relates to the term, the alt-right that everyone discussed. It was, from what I gathered, conflated with this, it's the underlining ideology that incentivizes young people to radicalize. So my question is, who is the alt-right and where's the evidence that the alt-right is radicalizing people?
Hi, my name is Harrison Weeks, and I'm another intern at the Washington Center. So you mentioned earlier some of the stats on the differences between violent extremism crimes based on Islam and others based on sort of white nationalism in the United States. So I just wanted to know if that sort of proportion that's quite similar is present in Western Europe as well, and if there are differences between the amount of violent extremist crimes which are based on Islam between the US and Europe, if that's based on differences in CVE between in the international perspective. How much is based on that and how much isn't, so.
I can speak to the first 2 questions because they're kind of related, I think. The sort of semantically how propaganda is identified, and it also speaks to how we've quantified the alt-right's influence, at least on the kind of larger conservative conversation. So that ultimately, with machine learning, we can sort of understand the implied definition of given concepts and words specific to some online community. So if we look at all the language that a community's published, we can sort of see how they define concepts, right? So there's like, that's the way that we all learn concepts. We sort of understand how everybody else talks about something, and then we kind of figure out what it is based on like hearing it hundreds or thousands of times. And so machines aren't quite that smart, but if you look at examples of something millions of times, then you start to get a sense of what it probably means. And so once you can do that mathematically, you can sort of see the trajectory of a definition of a concept and how that changes over time in a specific community. And so if people have very uncommon definitions of certain concepts, that's a sort of a key indicator of propaganda, especially if there's a real spike, if there's a real like big delta in how that definition changes from month to month. That's how we spotted sort of Russian influence operations in the spring, and also how we measured the influence of the alt-right on the larger kind of conservative community over the course of 2016 in general. So we looked at the way that the alt-right would describe a particular concept, so Judaism, for example, and then see whether or not that similar kind of definition of that concept was present in the kind of larger social media dialogue? Like, how did that change? What was the delta between the way that like regular conservative people talked about Judaism, and how did that change? And it became, the concept of Judaism became increasingly synonymous with something more like an epithet, with like some existential threat like globalism over the course of 2016. And so you could really see where the alt-right, maybe not intentionally, but as a byproduct of their language, or a byproduct of the language that was provided to them, say, by some outside actor, Russia, that they did have a lot of success in at least getting that particular idea to sort of spread throughout the adjacent communities, their adjacent communities online.
I'll say a couple things on that. The way I find propaganda is community detection. So, you start with something that you know is propaganda that's kind of obvious in a way, whether it's an ISIS video or something, Richard Spencer video. And then you see who's sharing it, and then you analyze that community to see who's talking about it. So when we have metrics that Jonathon and I designed for the ISIS that have proved to be very effective for all kinds of communities, not just extremists. As far as radicalization of the alt-right, I mean, the alt-right is foundational in as much as you can say that it has a single foundational idea. It's to be an umbrella group for a variety of mostly white nationalist and white nationalist organizations. As such, it is less potent than something like ISIS, which has a very cohesive concept of identity and understanding of what they're doing. It suffers the same problem that white nationalism has suffered in the United States for decades, which is that it's a fractious, divided group, and they can't get together on something. So what we're seeing right now, in case like in Portland, is that people who are, using terms and making reference and viewing on social media stuff that's related to the alt-right, we're seeing the low-hanging fruit, which is people who are maybe already have mental issues, who have some prior inclination to violence, are sort of acting out. The question is, how is white nationalism and the alt-right going to evolve over the next couple of years, and whether it's going to become we're seeing a split in the alt-right now, right? So we're seeing the racist alt-right sort of split off from the hyper-conservative alt-right. And, if they congeal into a clearly defined identity and ideology, that's when we really have to worry. But in the meantime, the fact that there are numerically so many more people involved with the alt-right as opposed to being involved with ISIS in the United States means that we're probably going to see increased incidents of violence connected to them, even though they're less effective at radicalizing and mobilizing. On the question about crime and the difference between here and Europe, what I would say is you can take out a compass and draw a circle on a map, concentric circles on a map around Iraq and Syria, and the closer you get to Iraq and Syria, geographically, the more involvement with ISIS networks you're going to see. And when you cross the ocean, cross the Atlantic to the United States, you see a drop-off. So as Jonathon correctly noted earlier, violent extremism spreads through exposure, through social contact. And so if where people live and where people move has an effect on how it spreads. So closer you get to Iraq and Syria, the more people are going to be involved in it. So Europe is closer than the United States.
Did you want to add?
No.
Okay. Great. Well, look, we are just about to wrap things up, but given that we're 2 blocks from the White House, and we're in a think tank, I would be remiss if I didn't ask each of you to close out with just, if you had one big suggestion or small suggestion, and let's put maybe the current leadership aside for a minute. As we talked about backstage, there actually is quite a bit of diversity of thought on the topic of CVE within government. What would you like to see this administration do differently from the Obama administration on the topic of CVE? If there's just one thing that you think, and let's just start with Jonathon and move our way down.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my stump speech on this during the Obama administration, and it would continue if in the event that there's any interest from this administration about continuing CVE, is define an outcome. Just understand the number that you'd like to move, and then orient your programming around that. Even if it's a small number, even if that limits the programming, like see if you can have an effect on something that we've all decided is meaningful, that we can count. And then if that's successful, fantastic, move on to the next number. If it's not successful, okay, then maybe you can change your tactics and continue to pursue that objective. And I think that until we do that, it's going to be really difficult. I feel like conversations like this have been going on for years, and I think we'll be here again in 2020 going like, how could we start measuring CVE if we don't reorient ourselves along those lines?
I think I would agree with him. I think aiding local communities as well is critical. I mean, communities themselves need to come up with solutions that are sustaining. You know, it's great to have government support and initiatives, but you know, if local populations see that this is beneficial for them, I see that as probably the most important item that I would highlight to the administration and those who are working in the policy circle, at least for the short, medium, and long term.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, again, is measurement. If you want the program to be successful, you have to define what success looks like.
And that definition has to relate to violent extremism and not to eyeballs or shares or likes. So ultimately, what I would say is that there are a lot of sacred horse things that certainly up until now have been beloved by policymakers in terms of town halls and soccer leagues and economic development and education programs, and they are not supported by the science. There is science available for this. This doesn't have to be done intuitively. We have research. We can do more research to find real correlations, and we need to let go of these aspirational, optimistic, if we make everybody's life a better place, then there will be less extremism approaches.
On behalf of New America, many, many thanks to our panelists for coming. Please join me in giving them a very warm thank you.